It is mainly the pattern on fabric aligning process that can be initially tricky, especially for beginners. Once the patterns are aligned and pinned and you feel good and assured that everything is aligned properly and staying in place, actually cutting the pattern should hopefully feel like a giant stencil cutting game. Well, maybe not that enjoyable if you've never done it before, but really cutting sewing patterns should be fairly simple if you follow some simple cutting rules. The end result should be fabric cuts that are identical to your corresponding sewing patterns. Here are some pattern cutting techniques and basic concepts to get started with today. Once the sewing patterns have been correctly aligned and pinned, the fabric is ready to be cut. Cutting sewing patterns is fairly straightforward, although the process varies based on your sewing patterns, type of fabric used, and how many layers are being cut. Taking these factors into consideration, choose between rotary cutters or fabric scissors to get the job done. There are three main types of patterns that will affect the cutting process. Patterns that are cut along the seam allowance edge require that you follow the pattern edges as you cut through the fabric layers. Think of it as a stencil that you are cutting at exactly the same shape. Patterns that are cut through paper following specific lines will require you to cut directly through the paper pattern and fabric layers underneath, following designated cut lines. These cut lines correspond to the pattern's outer seam allowance edges. Patterns missing seam allowance will need to be pinned or weighted onto the fabric surface first, after which seam allowance will be added directly onto the fabric using tailor's chalk or a fabric pencil. A clear marked plastic ruler marked down to the 1/16 of an inch should make this fairly easy to do. Once the seam allowance is added, the fabric pieces are cut following these lines. Cutting sewing patterns smoothly and efficiently will take some practice and experimentation depending on the fabric, how many layers required to be cut, and the cutting technique used. The following universal cutting rules should be used regardless of the project. Always keep fabric as flat as possible in the cutting process. This is often easier to do using rotary cutters, in which case the fabric layers will require lots of care when repositioned on the top of the cutting mat. Fabric scissors offer better grip and fabric control, but you should only lift the pinned pattern off the table surface a minimal distance necessary to cut the pattern pieces. Lifting the fabric too much risks shifting the fabric layers in the cutting process. Keep your free hand on the pinned pattern to ensure the fabric or fabric layers do not shift in the cutting process. This is a simple technique you can use to add some stability and keep the pattern and fabric layers smooth and properly distributed. Gently shift the pinned pattern if needed, but make sure the entire fabric layer or layers are shifted in the same direction. It is common in the cutting process to have to shift the direction of the fabric in order to get a better cutting angle. This should be done very carefully by repositioning the entire fabric layer in accordance with the desired pattern direction. Don't let the pinned pattern hang off the table during cutting. When the pattern pieces are not laying completely flat against the fabric layers, the shape of the pattern will not translate onto the cut fabric pieces accurately. Your pinned pattern should always be laid on a flat surface throughout and never hanging off the edges in the cutting process, regardless of how densely pinned and secured they are. Always cut on a flat surface, preferably square or rectangular if available. A flat surface is extremely important for achieving maximum transfer accuracy. It allows the pattern and fabric to lay flush against each other, leaving less room for cutting errors. Using the right tools is especially important in the pattern cutting process. If the blade on your scissors or rotary cutters needs to be sharpened or replaced, do so instead of forcing the fabric cut with worn blades. Cutting with a worn blade will not only distort the fabric edges, it may also pull on sensitive threads within the fabric structure or shift the fabric layers out of alignment in the process. Using sharp cutting tools will also be gentle on your hand and wrist, resulting in a more enjoyable work process. Use firm, long slashes along straighter edges. Longer cutting strokes result in a much smoother cut and provide more control along straight edges. Don't forget that a good pair of scissors is necessary to accomplish longer, smoother cuts. For increased precision, use shorter cutting strokes along curved edges. Shorter cuts allow for more control and grip. If you prefer to use rotary cutters, make sure you change your blade to a smaller diameter. As is true for any time you cut a pattern, pick up the next cut right where you left the last one to achieve smooth, precise edges with no interruptions. Cut right next to the pattern edges or directly on top of the pattern's designated cut lines, keeping all layers as flat and smooth as possible in the process. The resulting fabric cuts should be the identical replica of the pattern pieces in terms of shape, size, and their edges.